Hello there, welcome to the next message in our series on Habakkuk. We've been seeing how Habakkuk has been really wrestling with some deep issues, some issues of injustice, violence, the apparent aloofness of God in the midst of all that. And he's been trying to reconcile what he knows to be true of God, that God is just, that God is holy, with God's apparent indifference to the evil and the injustice that the prophet is witnessing on a daily basis. And we've been following this exchange between the prophet and God through as he voices his complaint and as God makes his response to him. We've been seeing that in the process Habakkuk is learning to live by faith in what were times of great upheaval, and our aim as we apply this is for us at a time of great upheaval in our day to learn what it means to live by faith. Last time we spoke and considered how Habakkuk speaks of putting himself in the guard post and up on the watchtower in order to hear what God would say to his latest complaint, which is how God in his holiness can employ the Babylonians without in some way becoming complicit in their evil and contaminated by that. And God responds by urging Habakkuk to get ready to write down what he's about to reveal to him and to be patient, because it isn't going to happen immediately. And so God then outlines from verse 5 to 20 his plans for Babylon. So let's read the passage together and consider what we can learn from this morning. Moreover, wine betrays. An arrogant man is never at rest. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and like death he's never satisfied. He gathers all the nations to himself. He collects all the peoples for himself. Won't all of these take up a taunt against him, with mockery and riddles about him? They will say, woe to him who amasses what is not his. How much longer? And loads himself with goods taken in pledge. Won't your creditors suddenly arise, and those who disturb you wake up? And then you will become spoil for them, since you have plundered many nations. All the peoples who remain will plunder you, because of human bloodshed and violence against lands, cities, and all who live in them. Woe to him who dishonestly makes wealth for his house, to place his nest on high, to escape the grasp of disaster. You have planned shame for your house by wiping out many peoples and sinning against your own self. For the stones will cry out from the wall, and the rafters will answer them from the woodwork. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with injustice. Is it not from the Lord of armies that the peoples labor only to fuel the fire, and countries exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord's glory, as the waters cover the sea. Woe to him who gives his neighbors drink, pouring out your wrath, and even making them drunk in order to look at their nakedness. You will be filled with disgrace instead of glory. You also drink and expose your uncircumcision. The cup of the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will cover your glory. For your violence against Lebanon will overwhelm you. The destruction of animals will terrify you because of your human bloodshed and violence against lands, cities, and all who live in them. What use is a carved idol after its craftsman carves it? It's only a cast image, a teacher of lies. For the one who crafts it shapes, trusts in it, and makes worthless idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to wood, wake up, and to mute stone, come alive. Can it teach? Look, it may be plated with gold and silver, yet there is no breath in it at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let the whole earth be silent in his presence. Here we have as God's response a very clear, explicit indication from God that he will call Babylon to account. that whilst Babylon under his sovereignty is going to, in a moment of time, serve his purposes within Judah, he will ultimately hold them fully liable and responsible for their evil actions, and will bring them to appropriate justice for those actions. Babylon will be judged, is God's response to the prophet. And that judgment here comes in the form of 5 statements of woe. Whilst the prophets often pronounced, of course, wonderful promises and spoke blessings over God's people, they did, of course, at times also pronounce judgment on individuals and nations that committed acts of evil. And this woe statement is a familiar device in the prophetic writings in Scripture. This word woe, this term woe, was not just spoken by anyone. It was a word that carried authority. It was not just an expression of how the person felt about a situation. God here isn't just expressing the grief that he feels or the regret that he feels. It was rather a statement that expressed and set in motion in its very utterance the judgment of God upon a situation. It signified then impending doom, judgment, condemnation, and the wrath of God. And so this is a pretty heavy word for us to be coming across and to discover repeated 5 times within this passage in Habakkuk. And it's not just an Old Testament word. It's not just a word on the lips of some of the more eccentric Old Testament prophets, if you like, in sackcloth and ashes. Let me ask you a question. I wonder who you think in the Bible was recorded as using this word woe more than any other. Well, it might surprise you to know that it was Jesus. The Gospel of Luke has twice as many woes, 13, than the nearest Old Testament book contains. Ezekiel contains 6. And only Matthew has nearly as many. There are 12 utterances of this word woe in Matthew. And so an interesting New Testament word study might be to look up the occurrences of this word and make a note of what kind of situations merit this pronouncement of judgment. Here in Habakkuk, we find God speaking then of the way in which he will most certainly judge Babylon in a particular way, as a response to the particular ways in which this empire or civilization or society is behaving in their moment of history. And so when we consider these particular statements, we discover a range of things that marks godless civilizations and societies which provoke a particularly severe response from God by way of judgment. So I'd like us just to reflect and consider these. First of all, we find material exploitation of vulnerable nations. Verse 6-8 describes the way in which Babylon amasses wealth through plundering many nations. There's an example here of an empire that's abusing its military strength and power to invade and exploit other defenseless nations. And that, in the eyes of God, is a reprehensible way to behave. And it merits a woe. It merits God's judgment. Secondly, the dishonest pursuit of personal wealth and security. Verse 9-11 describes this self-centered drive to build a nest for ourselves in a way that lacks in the process integrity and honesty. It's not here the making of wealth that provokes God's displeasure, but first of all the self-centered motive behind that, and secondly the illegitimate means through which that wealth is acquired. Thirdly, the establishment and development of godless societies. Verse 12-14 describes societies that are built on bloodshed, that are built on injustice. There is corruption in the very foundation of these societies. And it's in contrast to this description of godless society that's rooted and founded in these ways that we have this wonderful statement in verse 14. But the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord's glory. And so the prophet draws our attention to the alternative kingdom that God himself is building in the earth, which will ultimately be the one that triumphs. It will fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. It's a kingdom that has as its foundation the knowledge of God's glory. The next feature we find here that merits a woe in verse 15 to 17 is sexual exploitation. These verses describe those who ply their neighbours with alcohol in order to turn them into objects of pornography and to take sexual advantage of them. And then finally in verse 18 and 19 we find that this is a society that is marked by a misplaced confidence in idols. These verses describe the way in which they put their trust in what is man-made and inanimate. They give their devotion and place their confidence in that which is unable ultimately to give life to them. So, this is all very sobering as we read through these woes, as we reflect on the particular features of the society that warrants this kind of response from God. We have to keep reminding ourselves, don't we, that what was written here was written to a society that emerged and existed about 2,600 years ago. I mean, there's a shocking correspondence, I think, here to many of the features of our so-called modern civilized society today. So many of what we might call the systemic or structural evils of our own day are nothing more than just a mirror image of what we find here that marked Babylon in the days of Habakkuk. Our modern empires may not be advancing today through military strength and might as they exploit vulnerable nations, but they have done exactly that in the not too distant past, of course. And it can be argued that the modern empires of our day are the multinational companies, the corporations that actually continue to some degree to exploit vulnerable nations in order to amass obscene quantities of wealth for themselves. And so when you consider here these issues, they're very, very contemporary. When you consider the issue of the pursuit of personal wealth and security through dishonest means, you could be talking about a number of issues and features of our own modern capitalist societies. Just think, for example, about the whole issue of tax evasion. In 2018, apparently, in the UK, it's estimated that £70 billion was lost through some form of tax evasion. And of course, some of the most profitable companies in our modern marketplace use dubious means as a means of maximizing profitability. And then take the issue of sexual exploitation, which is very much an issue today, as much of an issue as it was then in the days of Babylon. The porn industry estimated to amount to nearly $100 billion. The world's largest free porn site apparently receiving over 42 billion site visits during 2019 alone. And at least 30% of all data transferred across the internet estimated to be porn related. And porn sites today receive more traffic than Netflix, Amazon and Twitter combined every month. And 35% of all internet downloads are estimated to be porn related. This is a live issue. And we have to read these words and consider God's response to these particular features of a godless society with real soberness in our day. And so what we learn here in Habakkuk 2 is that there is nothing new under the sun. That God is in no way indifferent to these particular features of a godless society. That he is not complicit in evil, he's not contaminated by it. He sits as a sovereign judge, and his response is one of woe. It's the pronouncement of appropriate judgment. So this is where it's helpful for us to zoom out of Habakkuk's own situation and consider the wider story of humanity. Babylon in the days of Habakkuk was, as we've seen, a godless, evil, ruthless empire. It existed alongside Old Testament Israel, and of course it came to invade Israel, as Habakkuk himself prophesies. There's the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. There's the sacking of the temple. There's the forced exile of several thousand Judites into exile. But Babylon in the Bible also comes to represent the godless world system generally. In the big story of the Bible, Babylon is a symbol of all societies that are hostile to God and rooted in human-centered thinking. It's symbolic of the kingdom of this world that stands in stark contrast to the kingdom of God. It's a term that describes the spirit, if you like, that marks godless human society or culture per se, that's founded on a rejection of God. In the New Testament, Babylon becomes associated with Rome. Peter speaks of she who is in Babylon. It's a veiled reference to what was probably the city of Rome in his day. And then, of course, in the book of Revelation, as John sees this vision, Babylon is used in a symbolic way to refer to man-centered human culture in hostility towards God. John in Revelation 17 describes how he sees a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Here in Habakkuk 2, we have a particular pronouncement of God's judgment on the Babylon of his day. But fast forward to the book of Revelation, and we find that pronouncement repeated as an expression of the ultimate judgment that will assuredly come upon all societies, marked by what we might call the spirit of Babylon. In Revelation 18, John goes on to speak of this, how the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail at the sight of the smoke rising from the fire that consumes her. In fear of her torment, they will stand at a distance and cry out, "Woe, woe to the great city, the mighty city of Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come." And so the themes that we find being played out within Habakkuk's day, in his small slice of history, are in many ways a microcosm of what's happening in the big story of the history of humanity. The Bible teaches that that story is inevitably moving towards a day of final, ultimate judgment. That's not just the teaching of eccentric Old Testament prophets who went around in sackcloth. That's the teaching of Jesus. It's the teaching of the apostles. And so in Matthew 25, Jesus speaks of how he himself will return, seated on a glorious throne, and he will separate the sheep from the goats like a shepherd. In John 5, Jesus speaks of a time that's coming, and he says all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good things to a resurrection of life, but those who have done wicked things to a resurrection of condemnation. Paul in Acts 24, when he's speaking to Felix, is described as speaking about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. And then as we've seen in Revelation, chapter 20, John sees a great white throne and one seated on it. Earth and heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. And I also saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works by what was written in the books. So we learn here something about the big story of human history, that there is a coming judgment. Now, on the one hand, that can bring us something of a reassurance, can't it? Like Habakkuk, you see, we can wrestle with so much injustice in the days in which we live, so much that appears to go under the radar of, as far as God is concerned. We can live, as Habakkuk perhaps did, with the wrong perception that somehow God's aloof and that injustice will ultimately not be appropriately addressed. The reality, however, of what the Bible teaches us is that there will be a day of final, ultimate, appropriate judgment. That, in one sense, can reassure us because it underlines the way that nothing will escape God's justice and that every act of evil will be appropriately judged. And of course, the judgment, as we read in those passages, will include the dead and the living. Jesus speaks in John of the way in which those who have escaped justice in this life and have died will come out of their graves and face judgment. And so, we can think of dreadful tyrants who have committed despicable acts and then, in an act of cowardice, committed suicide rather than face justice. Well, there's no escaping the judgment of God. Death itself is no escape. John sees how the small and the great will face justice, and so it's not just those with great responsibility, people maybe that epitomize evil, that will face God's justice. All of us will, the small and the great. So on the one hand, there's an assurance here, there's a reassurance here. But on the other hand, when we turn the camera in on ourselves, this is deeply troubling. We're not going to be judged according to human standards. We're not going to be compared to Hitler. We're going to be assessed not according to what our culture approves of or condemns. We will be judged by the God of Habakkuk, the one whose eyes are too pure to look on evil, and in the light of his moral purity. The one whom Habakkuk refers to as my Holy One, the one whose eyes are too pure to look on evil. It's those eyes that will peer into our own souls and make an assessment of what they see there. And I don't know about you, but outside of Christ and his finished work and his grace, that's not something that fills me with much confidence. Now, I say outside of Christ because this is, of course, in the big story of human history where the good news of the gospel comes to play. The good news of who Jesus is and what he's done becomes, in the light of this, intensely good news. As New Testament believers, we read the references and descriptions of judgment and wrath in the Bible in the light of what we know about the cross and what God's done for us there. The message of the New Testament is that for those who entrust their lives to Jesus, this final day of judgment has been brought forward in time. On the cross 2,000 years ago, God himself entered into our world and became our representative, our substitute. He took your sin and my sin upon himself. Every trace of moral impurity, it was attributed to him. And on the cross, God the Father peered upon his Son with those eyes that are too pure to look on evil. And he judged your sin in his body on that wooden instrument of execution. God's woe has been spoken. It's been spoken over the person of Jesus as he hung on that cross and on that hillside for you and for me. And in exchange for your sin, Jesus gives to you and me his own righteousness as a gift. That means as God looks on us with those same eyes, he extends favor and acceptance to us instead of judgment and rejection. That's the gospel. So to conclude then, here we come face to face with the reality of judgment. God reassures the prophet that the evil of Babylon will be appropriately judged. And he underlines in the process some of the particular features of godless societies that warrant his judgment: material exploitation, the selfish pursuit of personal gain through illegitimate means, the establishing of godless societies, sexual exploitation, and a misplaced confidence in idols. And it's all very relevant and it's all very contemporary. There's nothing new under the sun. But it points us to the bigger story of humanity. Our willful desire to live without reference to God and reject his good boundaries, our own pursuit of our own glory rather than the knowledge of his glory that will ultimately cover the earth, the establishment of human cultures that exist in hostility towards God, Babylon itself, the day of final judgment then that humanity is inevitably moving towards, and the way in which, for those of us who in Christ have trusted in the finished work of Jesus, the way in which that judgment has been brought forward, that he has taken God's woe in our place as our substitute, and in the place of that has given to us the free gift of his own righteousness. That's where we're going to end this morning, and we're going to turn now to sing together of this wonderful work of the cross and break bread as we celebrate the death of Jesus on our behalf. Why don't you join me as we